Hi, everybody. In the last video, we looked at the story of Lazarus, which took us up through verse 45 of chapter 11, and we will pick things back up there in a minute. But first, I want to take some time and talk about some big picture things about the book of John as a whole. You probably know that we have 4 Gospels in the Bible, 4 of the books that actually tell the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you may know that out of those 4, John is unique. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of the same material. They overlap quite a bit. And John has some of those same stories. He overlaps a bit with them. But he also has a lot of different material, focuses on different things, which just gives us a different perspective and kind of rounds out our picture of Jesus and of his life and ministry. And one of the things that makes John unique is that he devotes almost half of his book to the last week of Jesus' life. In the passage we're looking at today, if you look at chapter 11, verse 55, it says, "When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem," etc. And then if you look ahead to chapter 12, verse 1, it says, 6 days before the Passover. Now, the Passover was the Jewish festival weekend on which Christ was crucified. So that means we're only 6 days away from his death, and we've only finished 11 of the 21 chapters of this book. The next 9 chapters will be all about that last week of Christ's life, and then chapter 21 takes place after the resurrection. And in fact, it's even a little more concentrated than that, because out of those 9 chapters, 5 of them, chapters 13 through 17, are all about what happened the night before Jesus was crucified, the meal he shared with his disciples, and especially the words he spoke on that night. John thinks that night and those words deserve a whole lot of attention. So what that means for us today is that we have to understand that through these first 11 chapters, we've just been moving at light speed through 3 years of Christ's ministry. We have just kind of had glimpses of those 3 years. And now we're going to slow way down and give a lot of attention to the last week of Christ's life. So in a sense, we're only halfway through the book, but in another sense, we've really reached the climax. Everything has been leading up to this. And what you see in this last part of chapter 11 and the first part of chapter 12 is that things truly are at a crisis point. We've been following this theme throughout our study of this book, the big question of who is Jesus? Who do we say that he is? Jesus claims to be the Son of God. John claims that he is the Son of God. And you've heard me say more than once that everyone has to decide what they believe about that. And what you see in these verses is that at this point in Jesus' ministry, the nation of Israel has become really divided over that question. In verse 45, it says that many of the Jews who had come to comfort Mary in the loss of her brother were witnesses to Lazarus' resurrection, and they're convinced. They believe now. They've become followers of Jesus. But amazingly, some of them actually run back to the Pharisees and the religious leaders and tattle, because instead of rejoicing in this miracle and the power of God, they see it as a threat. Now, how is a resurrection a threat? How could this possibly be a bad thing? Well, in verse 48, they say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So their fear is that if too many people start to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, they will want to stage a rebellion against the Roman Empire, which the Romans will then crush and make life harder for everybody. It's a very practical, earthly concern. It shows that these guys have gotten pretty worldly and they don't actually have much faith in God at all. But this is where the story gets really interesting. Amazingly, that doesn't stop God from speaking to them. Later in the passage, it says in verse 49 that Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time, he says it's better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. And we learn that in his priestly role, he had actually prophesied that Jesus would die for Israel and for the scattered children of God to bring them together. Now, it sounds like that actually was a word from God, and that he and the religious leaders had misinterpreted it to mean that Jesus had to die to keep the peace with the Romans, to keep from rocking the boat politically. So in verse 53, it says that from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So that's what's happening on one side of the conflict. The religious leaders have become convinced that Jesus needs to die. And then it describes Jesus withdrawing from the public eye and how everyone who's gathering in Jerusalem is talking about him. He's the topic of conversation. Is he going to show up? Everyone knows the religious leaders are out to arrest him if he does. But then on the other side of the conflict, the first part of chapter 12 up through verse 20 has these two stories about the people who really do believe in him. You can read there the story of Mary anointing his feet with an expensive perfume, just pouring out her love for him, honoring him. Jesus says she's preparing him for the day of his burial. And then the next day, when Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem, you have the story of what we call the triumphal entry. Jesus being welcomed and celebrated as the Lord, the King. As he makes his way into Jerusalem, the people are quoting Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. And it says that word of Lazarus' resurrection continues to spread. So he's just getting more and more and more famous. So the stage is set. We have reached this crisis point where Jesus has enemies who want him dead. He has followers who believe he's the Messiah, and we're just days away from the Passover weekend when we know he's going to be crucified. And most of the rest of this book is going to describe those final events leading up to his death and his resurrection. In the next video, we'll see Jesus speak openly about his death, and we'll see you then.